My guest at this time is investigative journalist Sara Carter. You might also know her as a Fox News contributor, and she is the face of a new documentary exploring the opioid crisis in the United States. It's called Not in Vain, spelled V-E-I-N, and you can find it at notinvainusa.com. The documentary looks at the endless flow of opioids into the country, the devastation suffered by American families, and how community leaders and possibly our government can fight back. And Sara, thanks so much for being with us.
It's so great to be on with you, Greg. Thank you so much, and thank you for taking interest in what I think is probably one of the greatest national security threats that we're actually facing at this point in time.
And we're going to be talking about all the different aspects of this, and maybe you just answered my first question. What drew you to this story and to devote so much time and energy to it?
You're right. The national, well, not only what's happening to our children. Remember, I'm a mom of 6 kids, his, mine, and ours, right, that we love dearly. And as a parent, we're always trying to protect our kids from harm. But what really drew me to this was kind of like the Trojan horse aspect, the national security aspect of this story, and how it's been literally taking the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of our children yearly. The opioid epidemic, we put a lot of focus in the beginning, and rightly so, on pharma and all those issues of addiction that we were seeing in the United States. But what we weren't paying attention to was basically the drug cartels, the Chinese as well, who are pumping fentanyl into our country every day. People describe it as the 2.0, right, of this epidemic, and how they're integrating fentanyl and synthetic opioids into the drugs that they're pushing into the United States, which is the reason why we're seeing such an incredible increase in overdoses and deaths, particularly among the young. One of the reasons I got involved in this, I have to give it to my friends in Ohio, Full Story Foundation. Ohio is an epicenter, just like New Hampshire, just like we've seen in Chicago, we've seen in other places throughout the United States where this drug epidemic is really hitting so hard that they can't even keep up with it. The amount of children that they've seen in the morgues has increased exponentially to the point where in Ohio at one point they were bringing in freezers just to keep the bodies cool. They had to put them outside the morgue because children were dying at such a high rate. So they brought me into the documentary. We had talked about it over a year ago. I was able to raise the funding. Thank God, for being able to put this funding together and being able to get this documentary, 48-minute documentary, which is just the first of many we hope to push out up and going. It's a nonprofit documentary that's available for everybody, including our law enforcement officials who are now posting it on their websites, as well as educators and people involved in the community of addiction.
And again, you can find it at Not in Vain, V-E-I-N, notinvainusa.com. Sarah, I'm going to play a couple clips here and have you comment on some of the points being made here. This is quotes from a couple different people featured in the documentary about just how badly we're losing the battle of the border right now.
They have no policies. They don't have any real processes like we do in law enforcement to follow. So they're about making money, and they're going to do whatever they have to do to make money.
They have all the money in the world and all the technology and the manpower in the world to beat us. And that's exactly what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing. They're beating us.
And they're talking about the cartels. So just how badly are we losing?
We're losing at an exponential level. I can't even begin to explain to you the problems that we're facing, even in our law enforcement. I've been in communication with a number of top drug enforcement agency representatives across the United States. Also, our U.S. intelligence community is actively involved in this now because of the national security threats. I've been covering the border for decades. When I started my career, that's what I started doing, covering the gang associations, border associations, which led me actually into covering terrorism, terrorist organizations, and the nexus between those organizations and terror groups. I thought that was damaging enough. I couldn't believe what I was seeing in this film. Fentanyl pouring across our border. When I did these interviews with people as young as 12 years old, trafficking drugs into the United States, but drugs that are so dangerous that even 4 little grams of fentanyl, which are like 4 little grams of table salt, could actually kill. It would kill an adult human, and these are actually put into pills that are being manufactured in labs across the U.S., in trailers in Mexico. They're being pumped in through China. I think what you're hearing, especially in those two clips, is that we have a very serious border crisis. There is a very serious issue with what's happening on the U.S.-Mexico border, and if we don't pay attention to it, it's only going to get worse. We lose, I think in 2017, and these numbers are low, they're not even the actual numbers yet, are 72,000 Americans that were killed in this opioid heroin epidemic. A large number of those that were killed, a good portion of them, they believe was from fentanyl that is being put into these drugs to enhance them. It basically enhances them, and it's so cheap that the drug cartels are making exorbitant amount of money off of it, so they don't even care if they lose people at this point in time. It's the amount of money that they're making. Another issue that I think that those 2 points bring up and is really important to point out is fentanyl is not just used. They're not only concerned about it being used in the drugs that we've seen in our heroin. They're lacing it in marijuana. They're lacing it in fake pills. So your kids may think they're taking a Xanax or a Percocet or an Oxycontin, but what they're actually taking is something that was manufactured, like I said, in some backroom lab. That is actually a fake drug. Over 50% of them on the ground in Ohio right now, they've noted that are not real pills. But that fentanyl could actually be used as a weapon of mass destruction. I mean, you release fentanyl into the air in a movie theater, in a mall. You're killing people that come into contact with it because it's that potent, which is the reason why now the Border Patrol agents that I met with on the border, DEA, ICE, other people who've come into contact with drugs, they treat everything as if it's fentanyl because of the danger that it posed to their law enforcement.
Sara, one of the things I really like about this documentary is that it's not just explaining the depth of the problem and how much of a head start the cartels have against our valiant men and women in the Border Patrol and that sort of thing, but it does offer some solutions here. And one of them is offered by a person who's featured extensively in the documentary. His name's Chris Farrell, former Army counterintelligence officer, now with Judicial Watch. And here's what he thinks the government can do to help.
Here's my solution. A one-sentence order to the Department of Defense: secure the southern border of the United States. Declare the cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. They're currently designated as foreign transnational criminal organizations, and that just isn't cutting it. When they're declared to be what they are, terrorist organizations, you give the Mexican government a choice. They can cooperate and get on board and help us to fight them as what they are, terrorist organizations, or we can do it ourselves. But making those designations would change the playing field dramatically.
So, Sara, how exactly would it change the playing field? What could we do with that designation that we can't do right now?
Well, we can't target them the way that we want to target them. You know, they're criminal organizations. They consider them criminal organizations. It limits our ability to utilize the resources that we have available to us in the Department of Defense to go after some of these guys. You know, the Sinaloa cartel. So we captured El Chapo Joaquin Guzman, so Chapo Guzman is now in custody, but guess what? Another person's taking their place. They're running the operation just as they did. We know that they've basically captured, and we know this based on information coming from U.S. intelligence officials. I mean, they have hundreds of thousands of what they call foot soldiers, which is people on their payroll, people working for them. Not all of these people are armed. They are able to use the billions of dollars they amassed off of their drug sales and illicit weapon sales and other contraband to build these very mammoth narco-terrorist rings, and designating them under the Department of Defense as a terrorist organization would then unleash our Department of Defense resources, and we could work alongside the Mexican government. Look, we're already trying to do that. We're doing that with our U.S. intelligence apparatus. We're doing that also with our Department of Defense, but it's very limited. Once these guys are targeted as terrorists, we can unleash the best at them, whether that's Delta Force, whether that's Navy SEALs, and taking them out. I think they're really not feeling the pain because they really haven't been the targeted group, right? We can go after their associations. We can kind of target on the outside the drug trafficking. But remember, they're the ones that are paying for the drugs that are being transported into the country. They're paying it to be distributed across the country. We have hundreds of distribution centers. These drug cartels have hundreds of distribution centers inside the United States. I think Chris Farrell put it in the movie as well very eloquently. He compares it to Walmart. I mean, people can understand that. Walmart never runs out of milk. These drug cartels never run out of drugs. Why has it been allowed to get to this point? Why have we allowed this to evolve to the point that it's actually threatening our national security apparatus now, threatening American lives? We're seeing those deaths. If we change their designation, we can target them. We can target them in a way we never have targeted them before, kind of like we targeted Al-Qaeda, the same way we target ISIS, using the full force, that of our military, not saying we're going into Mexico with military personnel just offhand. We'll work with the Mexican government to help designate those resources, the money that's needed, and the resources that are needed. Remember, we got to be able to track these guys with ISR capability. We got to be able to give our DEA the resources they need to work with us and the FBI. And there is, according to some people that I've spoken with, there is some law that will back this. Now, how they designate that money and how they designate them as terrorist organizations would be interesting to see. I know it's something that they're discussing at the Department of Defense right now. It's something that the administration is very interested in. So the more and more we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I guess, is the more and more we'll get that out to the American people. But I think giving them something to be afraid of. And remember, these drug organizations, they have connections all across the globe now. This is a global world. Just as we have global connections, they have global connections. They've been moving a lot of their narcotics as well to Africa, into Guinea-Bissau. I've been talking to people in the DEA about this, and they've been doing this for some time, and they've developed contact with terror organizations in Africa. This opens up a whole different aspect of how we focus on this. You know, what are those relationships like? Do they utilize the drug cartels to move contraband or people into the United States? And that's something that we need to take a look at. And also, case we can't forget China and other nations like Russia that are actually producing fentanyl.
Sara, just a couple minutes left in our conversation, so two quick questions in that time. As you talk about the challenge of stopping the flow of drugs into the country, I'm sure you've heard the argument, probably more from the libertarian side. This is a perfect example of how the war on drugs is a failure. The reason these people are doing this is because there's a ton of money to be made, and the reason there's a ton of money to be made is because all this stuff is illegal. And obviously we're talking about pretty hard drugs here. I don't know how many people would be in favor of legalization of this, but ultimately their argument would be that the war on drugs is the reason that this is so bad, and if we weren't fighting the war on drugs, it wouldn't be this bad. What's your response to that?
Okay, we've heard that argument for years, and it's an understandable argument because you take away the illegality, right? And then you think, okay, well, then there's no way they're going to make money off of it. We really haven't seen that in Colorado. We've seen a number of problems arise, too, from marijuana sales. But we're talking here about fentanyl. We're talking here about heroin being produced in Mexico and the fentanyl. You could take away that apparatus of their drug-making arm, and guess what? They'll come to something new. These people have no respect for human life. They have no respect for our nation states. They would be willing to move anything in. You're not going to destroy these drug cartels by legalizing drugs. They'll go to something different. We've seen them move into child pornography. We've seen them do we can't legalize that. I mean, this is just crazy talk. I mean, there are things that these organizations are willing to do. They're going to go against every moral aspect of what we have as a nation, and across the globe, they're going to enhance those organizations by doing what they can. So that means if they need to make connections with terror groups, if they need to make more money by using fentanyl, we're certainly not going to legalize the movement of fentanyl into this country. I understand the arguments. You know, as a libertarian in some aspects myself, you think like, oh, well, you know, just let it go, and then these organizations will collapse because they won't be able to make any money. Believe me, I've been there. I've seen this with my own eyes. I've traveled into Mexico, into villages that are basically held prisoners by these drug cartels. I've traveled to Afghanistan and Pakistan. I've seen what these terrorist organizations over there can do and the money that they're making off human addiction as well, and as well as other aspects of illegal contraband, even human trafficking. We need to treat these people as what they are. When I asked the DEA agents that I was working with on this documentary, how do you describe them? What are they? They described them as monsters. They described them as pure evil. We're seeing the repercussions of that right now in the United States, not just in the deaths of our own children. We are fighting vigorously to save lives here with this documentary, but we've seen it in their actions on the streets as their smaller organizations, the gangs that they're paying to move the drugs, have gone as far as beheadings in Virginia, dismemberment of bodies, the threatening neighborhoods inside the United States. We're not dealing here with just a criminal drug organization. We're dealing here with something much more sinister, much more dangerous. This is about saving lives and saving our nation and really opening up the eyes to the American people about what's happening on the other side of the border. I tell people all the time, what would you do to save your child from a predator? And people say, I would do anything. And I said, well, there's predators at their schools right now trying to hook them on these drugs or just trying to give them some of these drugs at a party. And if that's the case, you may never see your child again, or your child's life will be taken from them so early that they may not even have a chance to recover. We have to take this seriously. We have to stop it before it gets any worse.
Sara, less than 60 seconds to go here, but I got to leave on a message of hope, because when you contrast the people perpetrating this with wonderful people like Pastor Johnny Amos, I want you to give about 30 seconds about just the work he's doing and what people like him are doing to try and restore hope in people's lives.
Well, we have Pastor Johnny Amos, Tom Thompson, ministers across this country. They are trying to get the churches more involved in their communities, reaching out to their parishioners, millions of parishioners out there. It's up to the churches. It's up to our communities. It's up to the moms and dads and, the PTA boards to really speak to truth here, to really let parents know what they need to do to protect their children. And I got to tell you, Pastor Johnny Amos out there walking the streets of Ohio every day in some of the poorest communities, reaching out to everybody, to the people that are forgotten. And remember, this is not just a poor person's addiction. We are seeing this across the board now. Children in upper middle-class neighborhoods all across the United States, just like Heidi Riggs, who's in our movie. Her daughter Marin died 2 weeks after her 20th birthday. We really need to do something to stop this epidemic. We really need to put the cartels on call. We need to tell our government and our administration that we're going to come out there with the full force of parents and resources, and we're going to fight them until this stops. And we may not be able to stop addiction. It's something that's been with us throughout history, but we will be able to put a stop to these drug cartels, and we will be able to make a significant difference in our country if we just stick together and work together and find solutions together.
Sara, it's a big challenge, but the start of solving the problem, of course, as you mentioned, is calling attention to it, and this documentary certainly does that. Thank you so much for helping us understand it better, and we look forward to the future installments of this as well. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was great being with you as well.
Investigative journalist Sara Carter, Fox News contributor. The documentary is Not in Vain, spelled V-E-I-N, Not in Vain, USA.com is where you can find it online. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.